Good morning, everyone. Kraig Kojian with the Downtown Long Beach Alliance here this morning with a great panel and a great webinar discussion designed for distancing, creative strategies to adapt public spaces to the pandemic and beyond. Obviously, we have a lot of challenges based on the health restrictions that certainly most states have experienced over the last 9 months, and some things that we have learned and some things that we will continue to learn. We have a great set of panelists this morning, and I'll have a moderator, David Downey, introduce them here in a little bit. But before we get started, I want to just provide a little bit of background on why this webinar exists and why this certain subject matter was selected, and really what the Downtown Long Beach Alliance, a property and tenant-based improvement district in Long Beach, California, has had to do with placemaking over the last few years. Namely, about 10 years ago, we decided to create a position for placemaking for the number of different projects and certainly the vision that we saw as important in involving the public space, the public realm, and open space in our downtown. And to that end, we started doing some different projects relative to creative crosswalks and murals, sponsoring events like Powwow, and really being able to create a welcoming, inviting, and certainly a healthy space for activity in downtown Long Beach. Obviously, the times have changed over the last 9 months, and we've learned a lot based on what we can't do and envisioning what we can do. And I want to be able to thank, first of all, our team to be able to put this webinar together, the people behind the scenes. Morris Mills, he's our policy and research analyst. Samantha Mellinger, who is our communications extraordinaire. Brock Howard, our COO. Stephanie Gonzalez is our placemaking manager, and Kelsey Mader is our executive assistant. Everyone played a huge role in bringing this together. The panelists came together very quickly and very willingly, and I want to be able to thank them as well. They bring a tremendous amount of expertise to the table, and certainly you'll hear about what their thoughts are as far as how they've evolved during the past 9 months and looking at public space in certainly a different manner, and what we all can learn from and what we can all really contribute to of what that public space will look like in the future post-pandemic. Couple housekeeping matters on this webinar. It's an hour-long roundtable discussion, and we'll save about 20 or 30 extra minutes for questioning. David Downey will facilitate the questions on the Q&A portion. Please submit your questions into the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen, and the questions then will be moderated by our team as well as David. And the chat feature is disabled for the duration of the webinar, maybe not. We'll figure that out as we go along. And again, this is a series of conversations that we'll have over the next few months. The next one will feature on the first Fridays of every month. The next one will be January the 8th, and we'll be discussing digital access. So again, keep your eyes tuned to announcements coming from DLBA, and with more information coming on future announcements. With that, I'd like to turn this over to David Downey, the president and CEO of the International Downtown Association. And I just have to really take my hat off to David and his team for really keeping IDA members and partners in the loop over the last 8-9 months, not only with the amount of information that they've been able to distribute to its stakeholders, but also the type of information that they've been able to deliver. And they've been doing webinars probably since early April when the pandemic first hit. And it was really to inform not only the CEOs and leaders of the organizations, but on a second weekly webinar, they were able to focus on subjects related to downtown management. And it's been tremendously helpful and beneficial for us as an organization to take from what IDA has been able to deliver. And it's really this type of project that we're presenting to you today, that we took a playbook, I took a page out of their playbook and being able to provide it to you today. So David, thanks very much for all that you've done, not only for organizations over the last many years that you've been at the lead at IDA, but certainly over the last year, and looking at what we have to do as leaders in our organizations, in our industry. So again, thank you for being here this morning, David. If I could toss it over to you and to introduce our panel and get the webinar started. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And quite frankly, Kraig, I appreciate everyone on the panel, everyone who's listening. I have a phenomenal staff team here at IDA that's made everything possible, as well as extraordinarily engaged board of directors, leaders, and members. Simply invite all of you to visit downtown.org, and you'll be able to find all those great people and resources to see that it certainly isn't just the face in front of you today. It is an army of community builders, and that's essentially what we all are. It's why I love this industry, and it's why it's a real honor to be able to serve as your moderator today. Our whole goal is to bring together experts like the 4 panelists we have today to really explore issues in real time, because I think that's what we've learned most about the times that we're in with this pandemic, is that we are learning from each other. We're all learning in real time, and the more we can share learnings with one another, the faster we can innovate, we can adapt, and we can evolve. With that, I am going to kick right into the meat of the program. Welcome all of our panelists. I'm going to invite you each to give your own professional introduction, your background, but to do so in terms of maybe a starting of the discussion. And we're going to lead with Midori first. And I guess, in addition to, the professional work that you do, give us a little context, all of you, if you would, about, public space. What is public space, and how has your thoughts evolved in these last 9 months about, what the public realm is all about? Because it's turned extraordinarily important for all communities everywhere in the world. Midori?
Sure. Thank you so much, David. Happy to be on this panel and excited to talk with you all. My name is Midori Mizuhara. I'm an urban planner and designer with Gensler, Los Angeles, and really spent the majority of my career designing, planning, activating public spaces, and those, going right into your question, those have been what we think of as traditional public spaces, parks and plazas, but also kind of co-opting forgotten spaces, streets themselves, parking lots, alleys even, and helping communities reimagine those spaces through means of activation, arts and culture, bringing the community in to really change their kind of, mentality of what these spaces could be and the potential. So I've spent a lot of my career doing what's called tactical urbanism, setting things out and temporarily to see and demonstrate what they could be in a long-term potential kind of capital project way, kind of the step before. So my role at Gensler, we work on many streetscape designs, plazas, things like that. So I'm really focused on public realm design. And to get to your question, I think especially places like LA and Southern California, but cities all over the country traditionally that have, come of age and kind of organized around the automobile, maybe parks haven't been as equitably distributed as they should be, but what we do have a lot of is streets and sidewalks. And, these are our largest public space asset that we collectively own. And I think if there's a silver lining to this year, which has been so challenging, it's seeing folks, cities and organizations and businesses kind of co-opt that space a little bit more, move the needle to the human and habitation instead of car and habitation. And just personally, side note, I was shopping for a bike this year and I was on 10 lists for different bike shops in LA. Everybody was sold out of bikes. And I see a bike in your background, Brian, which kind of gave me a little bit of hope. People are exploring their neighborhoods on foot, on bike, businesses are spilling out. So if there's an opportunity here, and how I'm thinking, I've worked on the public realm and this panel has for years and years, but I think in the general public, there's beginning to be a mind shift of a lot of these streets and places can be more inhabited by humans and more real estate can be given to bikers and walkers. And so that's kind of how I'm changing my thinking around this.
Terrific. I'll look forward to the next hour in discussion with you, Midori. Yep. Norma, why don't we go to you? Again, when Midori actually kind of set it up for you when she talked about traditional parks. A little bit about your professional background and the role of public space from your perspective.
Good morning, David, and I'm so honored to join Midori, Shannon, and Brian on this panel. And good morning to all our viewers and listeners. My name is Norma Edith García-Gonzalez, and I am honored to serve as the director of the Los Angeles County Parks and Recreation. And just a little bit about the organization. We manage over 70,000 acres of parkland open space throughout Los Angeles County. We're one of the largest landowners. From large wildlife sanctuaries to our regional parks, to our small park nodes in our unincorporated communities. But our park system has over 50 million visitors annually. And I have to say that with this pandemic, what we've absolutely seen, and this is not just in Los Angeles County, but throughout the nation, we've seen community members really find and use parks and open spaces as places of respite, for mental, a mental sanctuary, but also to really, enjoy and get physical, social, and emotional well-being throughout this pandemic. In 2016, LA County Parks and Recreation led this countywide park needs assessment, which really looked at, through an equity lens, the needs for parks and open space throughout Los Angeles County. And that led through to Measure A, which was approved by the voters by almost 75%. And I share this with you because I strongly believe that there's been such coalescing regarding the need for this public open park space. And parks, because of Measure A, needs to serve as a vehicle to really help to heal our communities, not only from COVID, but from every other issue that has been exacerbated because of COVID. And so I wanna just mention and reiterate how critical the public open spaces and parks have been to really the emotional well-being of our communities during COVID. And so I look forward to talking more about parks, open space, and public spaces.
What an enormous asset that you're responsible for with all of the parks throughout the county. And Midori, you talked about streets as an element of the public realm. Shannon, welcome aboard to the panel. A little bit about your background and kind of where you look at and practice your expertise in the public realm.
Thanks so much, David, and good morning, everyone. And I'm really excited to be part of this panel. My name is Shannon Heffernan, and I'm the Urban Design Director at Studio 111. Studio 111 is an landscape architecture and urban design firm based in Long Beach, and I lead our urban design team. And we are and have been focused on placemaking efforts for communities and downtowns. And this includes many temporary transformations to streets and public space in the public realm through pop-up interventions, or even, like Midori had mentioned, tactical urbanism initiatives. And what's been really interesting is we've applied our past work to assisting businesses during this pandemic, not only just businesses, but cities, business improvement districts, property owners, and restaurants in adapting public space to provide resources and different opportunities for outdoor dining and helping cities launch their alfresco programs. So that's an interesting kind of approach to our work during this trying time that we're all in. And as Midori had mentioned as well, COVID has really reframed our thinking on what public space is or what we define it as. We've now opened up our definitions of public space to streets, bike paths, sidewalks, rooftops, vacant lots, surface parking lots, or even the top of a parking garage. I've even seen those spaces being used as public gathering spaces for movies. One of the things that we've really seen during this pandemic is that the barriers to creating public space or temporary public space have dramatically dropped or temporarily been suspended during this pandemic, which has been great. The process has been radically simplified and streamlined through permitting and approvals of public space, just making public space more possible. So what's really changed is the implementation of public space right now during this pandemic is happening really fast. And obviously there is, like Norma mentioned, such an unprecedented demand for public space during this time. it's really at, the nexus of providing benefits to communities, improving public health, providing access to outdoor recreation, or even kind of being that lifeline for economic resilience for businesses. And it's great to hear that it's finally taking priority in conversations over parking. So that's really exciting, as well as more cities are allocating their resources to adding these enhancements to the public realm.
For all the urbanists listening to us, the idea of the balance between pedestrian and automotive is always kind of the holy grail of most of these conversations, because we're talking about people, and certainly in a pandemic, we've even had to reconsider what that truly means from a community health perspective. Thank you so much, Shannon. You also use the term tactical urbanism. I'm going to take a really quick moment and say it's that temporary reutilization of space that becomes this new dynamic of design where some call it lighter, faster, cheaper. There's ways in which we're just utilizing, as you introduced, I think a great example, rooftops of garages, and how might we reutilize that public space for a temporary installation of some sort to make it more usable, not just as a parking structure, but perhaps for people as well. Thank you so much. Brian, how about yourself?
Thanks, David, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be part of this panel, so much so that, I don't know if I have a whole lot to fill in on that first question, but I'll do my best. My name is Brian Ulashevsky. I'm part of City Fabric. We're a nonprofit urban design studio here in Long Beach. We're dedicated to reshaping communities through public interest design, planning, policy, and advocacy. And so that takes a lot of different forms, everything from housing affordability, environmental justice, active transportation, open space access, and community development. And so this is a really interesting time that we're seeing. We were at sort of an inflection point where a number of communities were beginning to explore what it means, what public realm is, what public space is, and looking at it in different ways beyond the traditional park. And so Midori and Shannon both mentioned, looking at our streets, looking at our public right-of-way. I mean, if you look at cities across the nation, they have different patterns, different sort of densities of street networks, but in most cities, a large, substantial part of their land area is dedicated to public right-of-way. And the public right-of-way is those sidewalks, those streets, parkways, medians that exist between the properties. And in a city like Long Beach, where we have 50 square miles of land area, it makes up about a quarter of our land area. Those streets, those sidewalks, those medians, if you think about that in a different context, that is 9 central parks, New York Central Parks, evenly distributed throughout the city. And, I mentioned that because it changes your thought on how space is allocated and what those purposes are. Someone had mentioned that we have been default building our cities to serve the automobile, whether it's moving cars or parking cars. And I think this is a great opportunity that we were at this cusp of talking about streets in a different way. And then COVID hits, and it's forced us to even further reimagine to support public health, to support economic development. And at the same time, we have lower volume of car trips. And so we're seeing a different pattern and different things emerge that some of this might continue going forward. So I think, there's been a lot of adaptation, a lot of evolution, a lot of change and a lot of experimentation over the past 9 months that was not taking place in such a high degree. So it'll be interesting to see, as things, quote, return to normal, what is the new normal?
You provided the perfect synopsis to the introduction of everyone's expertise and the definition of the public realm. So we have now this 25% of the entire municipality that is considered the public realm, be it sidewalks, streets, parks, and open space, even parking structures. This is what we want to explore. And so I'm curious from each of you, and I'm going to ask for the first person that wants to raise a hand. Now that we've defined public space, talk to me a little bit about the value and benefits that you've seen as we've adapted that for the pandemic, because we've had to think about it differently from a distancing perspective. And also, too, who do you think's benefiting from these adaptations? Who would like to go first? Norma, terrific.
This is a great question, David. One of the LA County parks throughout the summers, in a normal summer, really activates about 33 unincorporated communities to really create senses of community. So we open our parks and we do programming, music, concerts to really bring, especially in our most vulnerable communities. This year, obviously because of COVID, we weren't able to do that, but we knew that some of our most vulnerable unincorporated communities who live in such denser environments and who have less park space didn't have the luxury to have those parks near them where they can go and walk and have ample lot of space. So what we did is in 11 unincorporated areas, we worked with Public Works, we worked with Metro, we worked with local bus lines, we worked with local business owners and local community members. And what we did is on the Thursday and Saturdays for about 8 weeks, what we did is we closed down the streets adjacent to the parks. And these are usually smaller urban parks. And what we even did is we were passing out masks, passing out a lot of the things that needed so people can be safe. But we encourage residents to come out and to exercise. We're very concerned that children and families weren't getting outside and weren't able to do so safely in their community. And so we encourage them to walk, bike, come out with their strollers, their skateboards. And we have thousands and thousands of people not doing it at one time, but throughout the 11 unincorporated communities. And we got lots of positive feedback, but what we mostly saw is just children being outside and being able to run. And they were doing so on the streets very safely. And originally, I just want to mention, we got a lot of pushback from community members saying, what do you mean I can't go in and out of my driveway for 4 hours? Those same community members were then thanking us because they were able to walk safely and doing so in their community and getting some respite and exercise. So I also think that as Shannon, Midori, and Brian has stated, the use of public space has really created very innovative ways to really claim public space. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the panelists to hear about some of those more innovative examples.
Yeah, looking for those areas where we needed to expand the public realm and take advantage of more space, because we know distancing was important. You know, there were similar street closings in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco that said we need places where our kids can play safely. That's a fantastic example. How about from another panelist?
Thanks. I could jump in here. Just kind of with my direct experience with alfresco dining. This has also been a silver lining during the pandemic. Alfresco parklets have greatly contributed to street life and adding vibrancy to main streets, where I feel like so many people have benefited, whether it's all of us who were cooped inside for 3 months and finally having the opportunity to go to a restaurant, even if it was dining outside, or just a community member strolling on the street and finally seeing people again, or the restaurant itself. I feel like what some of the benefits that we've seen from alfresco is just this importance of local business, community building. I think it's, a lot of residents are now going out to support local businesses and local establishments more, just to make sure that the main streets survive and even thrive during this time. Another benefit that I've actually seen, and this is for open streets projects as well as alfresco, is the departments, city departments have been communicating really well during this time. They've even been making these projects some joint departmental projects. I've noticed that silos are being broken down. Cities have been pushing for innovation, mostly out of necessity. At this time, I've also seen new partnerships between cities, where cities are openly sharing resources and new ideas with each other, and even strengthened communication channels between cities and business improvement districts and property owners and community members. And so I think that's really great. And I'm hoping, some of that can continue once things hopefully get somewhat back to normal.
And can you give us a refinement on some of the terminology? So when you say al fresco and open streets, you've referenced in the past, the European model, for instance. Just for our audience, how would you describe that for what they've probably seen and experienced?
Right, so there are different types of al fresco dining, just based off of what's being permitted in certain cities. Sometimes it could be even as simple as outdoor dining. Sometimes it's taking over parking spaces and converting that space to outdoor dining through like a temporary parklet. So it's kind of what this whole al fresco term means. It's been successful and common in many European cities across the world. For open streets, that's an initiative that Long Beach actually has through Beach Streets. It's where you close down a street for a day, and it's an opportunity where the community, you close down a street to vehicular traffic for a day. And so it's where the community can go out and experience that street differently and reimagine that place differently as an opportunity for them to walk and bike and engage with other community members. So those are two really fantastic programs that I know a lot of cities are focusing on right now.
Terrific. I appreciate that. Much like Norma described, opening the street as extra play space for the kids. It could include, dining, picnic, gathering, things of that nature. Midori, I'm curious how you've seen your work evolve now with Gensler and through this pandemic period.
Yeah, just to add to something Shannon mentioned that really resonated with me was, I've had clients want to accelerate their projects, and we've gotten a couple new clients this year. And I think COVID has really shined a light on what's important to communities, businesses, neighborhoods. One client came to us at the very kind of beginning of this, and they were a bid and saying, how can we have a visionary thinking about our stretch of street? Our businesses are in emergency mode, they're bleeding. It's kind of all hands on deck, but we're thinking long term. Can we use this crisis as a little bit of a kickstart to think long term about how the street can be better long term? Obviously, the pandemic will hopefully have an end date, but it's an opportunity to rethink our street 10 years down the line. So we're seeing public agencies, City of Los Angeles, a couple bids really come to Gensler and think about long-term capital projects of widening sidewalks, creating a more habitable and pleasant place for pedestrians and businesses to spill out, not only for health and mental health, but business and economic development for small businesses, which are really hurting right now.
It's been said, though, not to be tone deaf, don't let a good crisis go to waste. But by that, I think the intent is we have a demand to reutilize and re-envision our public realm. How can we take that even further and begin to understand how it becomes an even more important asset for all of our community members? Brian, you work with a great number of nonprofits, and so you've been looking at how this capacity building, I think, plays out in the public realm. How's your work been evolving since pandemic?
Well, I mean, obviously everybody's gone into crisis mode, whether it is the economic crisis or the public health crisis. And, we have been obviously been supporting our business community with outdoor dining programs, but we've been also collaborating a lot with our public health department, and because Long Beach has its own public health department as well as our parks department, at looking at how we can better serve those communities that are most impacted by COVID. Norma had brought up the park needs assessment that the county had done a few years ago. It was an incredible amount of data and community engagement that went into that to define park needs, laying over public health indicators like asthma, teenage pregnancy, heart disease, with environmental indicators, environmental justice, language access and isolation, and even economic drivers. And when you look at those maps, they overlay quite succinctly with the negative impacts of COVID and the cases and the death rates, and those overlay with our historic redlining maps from nearly a century ago. This is systemic racism that is taking place that is still that we still see today. And as we're looking at COVID and adapting our public realm to serve those public health indicators that are immediate now, we are also looking at opportunities of how long-term they can address the other public health impacts and economic impacts. And so again, looking at how our streets can be better suited to serve not just automobiles that are traveling through neighborhoods, but instead serving the neighbors, the residents that are living in those neighborhoods. And so, it's taken a lot of work, but I think the crisis level of the public health crisis that we're seeing day in, day out in our news has made those inequalities much more apparent than people would otherwise have seen just a year ago.
Systemic racism, inclusion, equity. This is really an opportunity that we now have to reverse the trends of decades and centuries. And the public realm is the public realm. It is for all. As we began to adapt it, though, in these very recent 9 months, I'd love to explore a little bit of maybe the challenges that still exist, because there's the true reality of we're doing the work, and behind the scenes, I think Shannon did a great job talking about how governments are evolving and partners are working together newly. Kraig, I'd even introduce, welcome any comments that you have in this regard, but there's also the mechanics and the ongoing work of keeping these spaces viable. So to the panelists, and again, I'll ask for someone who's interested, I'd like to explore, now that we are reutilizing and envisioning public space, what are some of the inherent challenges that you see coming out of the ways in which we are using them? Who would like to jump in first? Brian?
I'm just gonna use this as my plug for all the appreciation I have for Norma and her colleagues at maintaining parks. Tactical urbanism is really, great, and it's fun to do the design exercise and the pop-ups. And there is challenges on managing any sort of bureaucracy, and it's fun to be able to engage our community to sort of establish these tactical interventions, but maintaining them is no fun. It's not fun to wipe down the chair when somebody spilled their soda on it. It's not fun to empty the trash can. It's not fun to replace the tetherball when it's gone missing. And so that's the challenge, is having stewardship and ownership that this is a shared effort to maintain these open spaces. And something that we have definitely seen as part of Open Streets installations throughout the COVID crisis is, in Long Beach, the Open Streets and success has been really on the park. Like one of the major sort of benefits has been our sort of temporary parklet program, and there's over 100 of them that have been installed over the past 9 months, and it's been largely the responsibility of the adjacent property or business owner to take that on, and they see the direct benefit. It's their tables, it's their customers, it's their patrons, it's their receipt sales. But the ones that we see that we have a bit more challenge is when it's a shared space, when there's shared responsibility, where the parts of maintaining and supervising and cleaning is not always equal. And so we've had some successes, but that has been a bit more of a struggle. And the business improvement districts are doing an incredible amount of work trying to support these. But again, this is parks departments have entire armies of people to maintain these spaces. And so it is something that is a challenge. And it's something that I think we're all learning. It's, as we work with new business owners that are looking at new outdoor spaces, we actually have sort of a guide of what to expect when you're expecting everything from, how to think about the types of furniture, because somebody's got to bring them in, somebody's got to bring them out every day. So there's a lot of challenges to it. And it becomes, if they see the benefit directly, it becomes a more obvious worthwhile investment. But when it's a shared, you lose some of that sort of direct connection, but there is still a benefit to the shared community.
And this is always a bit of the struggle that we have in the urban place management industry, IDA, and all of our members across the world, is this understanding of it's a public-private partnership. And I think you teed it up terrifically. And I actually would like to go to Norma, and then I'm going to invite Kraig to kind of give his perspective. So Norma, from the government perspective, if maintenance and it's hygiene, it's safety, it's security, it's sanitation in the era of pandemic, how have you had to respond as, parks and open space from a governmental perspective? And then likewise, Kraig, how has things evolved from the BIB's perspective in this regard?
I will share a little bit about some of the challenges. The county, like many cities and park and recreation agencies, I want to mention that whenever there's an economic downturn, the first budgets that are always cut are parks and recreation. They're always seen as not essential, and you want to keep the law enforcement and everything else. I think we've seen a different movement, not only in Los Angeles County, but throughout this nation and I think we've talked about how important these public spaces have been for communities. And so we had a budget curtailment, and we actually took a significant budget curtailment when it came to our maintenance and operations. The Board of Supervisors immediately restored that, and at least when it came to our maintenance. And so that was a significant first step for us because it was a strong recognition that maintaining the public open space was very critical during COVID. To the other layer of, it's not just maintenance now, it's sanitizing and disinfecting to ensure that people can utilize the public open spaces and those amenities like restrooms, like tables, like picnics, and can be safe doing that. So I feel that there is a strong recognition that maintenance is so critical to utilizing and having vibrant, open and public spaces. I do want to mention also that we've been making a very strong case that in order to really help, I think as Brian eloquently stated, communities who've been impacted the most systemically are impacted the most because of COVID. And how do we help revitalize these communities and families who have lost jobs? And I think investing in public jobs and creating opportunities between the public and private sector to invest in jobs that in turn have a public benefit, like parks, open spaces, I think is a strong opportunity for workforce development, but as well as a strong recognition that we need to find a solution, a long-term solution to sustain our public spaces.
There's several things there. I found myself wanting to unpack the New Deal, Roosevelt era, bringing our communities back. We've got a pretty lengthy recovery ahead of us. But going back to something Shannon mentioned about the partnerships, and congratulations, so glad that the supervisors saw the importance of maintaining funding for maintenance and sanitation. It's a public-private relationship in these shared spaces that Brian spoke to, and I'd just love to open up your microphone. You're on mute there, Kraig, and say, now here's where the private sector can step in and also assist in this public realm. It's the work you do each and every day. How has this evolved from the maintenance challenges for all of your programming in downtown, as an example?
Yeah, and so in downtown Long Beach, when the Open Streets program was announced, it was, and we had, prior to COVID, we had parklets, but all the parklets in our city were private. There were private parklets associated with the adjacent business, which was responsible for developing, paying for, maintaining that space. We did not have any public parklets in our city. And then when Open Streets was introduced, based on obviously the pandemic, there was some leniency there. But at the same time, we looked at who was going to be responsible for the management and the maintenance of those spaces. And then we started developing these parklets, temporary parklets, which did not have to go through the same approval processes that were designed for permanent parklets. And I think, and I'm going to probably exaggerate a little bit, but I think leading up to the July 4th weekend, I think the city was able to throw out a number of K-rails. I'm going to say 50 or 60 different locations. They got them up in 2 or 3 days where these businesses were now able to put out tables and chairs and extend their dining rooms, because we still didn't have indoor dining. We only had outdoor dining. They were able to utilize that space in a very short amount of time. So what they were able to do, the city was able to do in a very short period of time on a temporary basis, has had some sustainable success to them, but also some challenges. And there was some lacks in those policies, as well as those practices of these businesses perhaps not complying with these standards and the policies that we had designed, or that had been designed through the health orders. And that created some challenges as well from an enforcement standpoint. But going back to Shannon's point and the way you teed up this question, David, regarding the partnership, we are trying to break down those silos, and we are noticing now that more departments, and it becomes interdepartmental at the city level, that they are working now closer together, whether it's special events and filming, which permits events, development services, which does the planning and developing of entitlements, as well as public works, who does the maintenance of the public realm. All of these departments are now working together, but we've elevated the conversation. Just last week, we pushed this conversation, our bid pushed this conversation to economic development. And we felt as though it becomes now an economic development question and a concern. So what we've done is we've raised the conversation to economic development, got these partners all together, and just so the audience knows, in Southern California, effective in a few days, no restaurants will be able to serve outdoors, where LA County has not been able to serve outdoors for a few weeks now. No restaurants in Southern California will be able to serve outdoors. Well, okay, so that's going to be a downtime on all these parklets and the investment that these businesses have made over the last few months on outdoor dining. Now they become quiet. What we want to do is take advantage of this quiet time, develop policies that everyone will be able to adapt in Long Beach and be able to come out of this knowing what all these policies are. And that includes the winterization of these spaces, because yes, I know we're in Southern California. Some of the audiences may be in different cities like DC. Thanks, David. But at the same time, it's like, okay, what are we going to do to be able to offer the space to be comfortable, healthy, safe, and inviting, and still build the consumer confidence that brings out those shoppers and those diners to these spaces. And it's expanding these spaces, not only to restaurants, but also for retail. Obviously, now this retail space has been reduced in Southern California to 20% of the occupancy of their indoor space. Now, can retail use the outdoor space as well? We've talked about dining, but we also have a retail component as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, those of us not in Southern California feel terribly when you can't wear your shorts and flip flops. But the point's well taken, and it actually points to another challenge that I've seen crop up around the country. Perhaps Shannon and Midori have seen this with some of your clients, where the criticism that we're privatizing public space. I think we've made a great case for the value and greater utilization of public space. But if it's public and now we have restaurants or retails or pop-up, as you said, Shannon, or you're looking long-term, activation of the space, Midori, do you have some thoughts on that argument, where are we privatizing public space, or is that actually a good use of the public space?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think this has been a challenge really that I've grappled with for my whole career in working on public realm projects, especially in times of crisis. The public sector, as Norma mentioned, the budgets get cut, and that in an ideal world there would be enough funding in the public agencies to fund and program and activate all these spaces. But I think there is something really beneficial about creative partnerships, not only with the private sector, but with nonprofits. And if you look at any successful public space across the country, and it's the kind of unsexy part, right? It's what's the governance structure? Who's paying for the security guard at night? Who's paying for the stage rental and the lighting? You know, all it's wonderful to see a rendering of a park and saying we're having 100 concerts this summer. Who's paying for that? Is that, you know, and in my previous role, we would write governance structures for these places, and there's tons of case studies where the dial is sometimes in the middle, public private, and sometimes it's skewed all over the map. So there can be a nonprofit partner, a private partner, a public, and funding streams are creatively woven together like a braid almost in making these really successful places usually have a component of all three of those. And ownership is and accountability is taken with the neighboring land uses, and maybe, you know, there is a pay-in per square footage of rentals surrounding that park, because obviously the private sector sees a huge benefit in a beautiful, activated, and safe public realm. So it's really, it's different every time, and it's really just as creative as designing the space, I think.
And Shannon, why don't you add to this?
Yeah, I actually wanted to piggyback off of a lot of the comments that Kraig had mentioned. I think as of now, we're not seeing much pushback on the privatization of public space, especially with our alfresco parklets. It hasn't been much of a conversation in most cases. I think that the need to keep small businesses alive is being universally acknowledged. We have, however, just seen a little bit of pushback on how that privatized space is being used. Some retail businesses, like Kraig had mentioned, still do need parking or designated curbside space for retail purchase pickup. I think that now with these new government orders in place, there may be more of a demand for curbside pickup for food and less of a demand for outdoor dining. Luckily, one of the things that we did with the whole alfresco concept is that these interventions are temporary. And with them being temporary, they can be adaptable. And so early on with our alfresco programs, we actually made in-field design decisions where we thought, if we thought a parklet was too large, we reduced it in size, or we expanded it in some other areas, just based off of the feedback that we had been receiving for adjacent businesses. I think the challenge, though, is not every main street is 100% restaurant or 100% retail businesses, and there needs to be some give and take between, you know, retail and restaurants.
I think what we've been able to illustrate. Oh, Brian, please.
I was just gonna sort of chime in on the privatization side. You know, we're in probably some of the strongest public space advocates in our community, but we're also really strong supporters of parklet programs with the outdoor dining. You know, the trade-off is for us is, you know, you have a private automobile parked curbside for 15 minutes to 2 hours versus, and that's for, you know, one car owner, possibly 4 passengers, and that same space can accommodate, you know, pre-COVID can accommodate probably 24 diners or patrons. And you know, it continues to be a privatization. It's just not for an automobile storage. And so, you know, instead what you have is a pedestrian space that activates the public realm and also provides traffic calming, oftentimes provides additional landscape opportunities. So, you know, I am very sensitive to the discussion about privatization, and there is certainly, you know, an extreme, and we're actually seeing that extreme right now. You know, there's certain places, certain commercial districts, certain business districts that have a bounty full of dining parklets right now. And, you know, it's you know, in our sort of east side of Long Beach called 2nd Street, Belmont Shore, it's interesting is that there was an attempt to create a more permanent parklet about 5 years ago, and that business owner was nearly chased out of town for even proposing such a diabolical premise as removing a parking stall. But that same community right now probably has 4 dozen parklets, and it's a pretty extreme vision of privatization of the public realm. And so I think, as we're looking towards permanence, is they're probably not going to be giving up their parklets in the future, but there will need to be sort of a middle ground. And I think there will be a middle ground as the interior spaces become accessible. But there is sort of a balance that we're going to have to make. And it's not just the sort of privatization on the sense of taking public space for commercial benefit of one or two business entities, but there's also issues around accessibility and making sure there's clear paths of travel, making sure that there isn't nuisances, both as far as stormwater management to noise. So I think the privatization is an important question, but there isn't sort of a black or white answer from our perspective.
Yeah, I think you now have a third expertise, which is moderation of a panel discussion, because you seem to provide the perfect segues into the next sections of our conversations. We do have about 15 minutes left in the formal portion of the roundtable, so I invite the audience to start teeing up some additional questions if you'd like to pose them to the group. And I just want to echo something that kind of came out of that last section. Midori spoke about the governance and the braid, if you will, which I thought was a tremendous metaphor. My own hometown of Detroit came back from bankruptcy because of the work done by the private sector, the public sector, and the philanthropic sector. And so this idea of how we're governing spaces and our roles and responsibilities, how they're financed, we understand it's not all on the backs of government, and a whole lot of different dynamics come to play. And I think, Brian, you did a great job illustrating how even privatization can be thought of differently than just a traditional viewpoint on that. So here's the next part of our conversation that I'd like to explore. We've blown the walls off of traditional norms. We've seen where everyone can, I think, better understand through this conversation the dynamics that are at play in public space, but through their own experiences, how adapting public space for new ways is absolutely helpful for the community, and especially during a pandemic. So now the challenge we all face is moving forward. What is it that you think we should be targeting, and how can we strategically take these interventions during pandemic and start thinking about how those play out in the long term? Who are we serving? What are the potential successes, and maybe what are some of the challenges that we'll have to overcome to, in particular, make sure that the resources are there, for instance, from the Board of Supervisors. But let's start thinking about transitioning long term. Shannon, let's start with you.
Sure. I just wanted to jump in because I think that these programs are very successful. And I guess this kind of touches a little bit on equity. I know that when a lot of cities launch these programs like Open Streets or El Fresco, even during phase one, they did have equity targets in mind when deploying these programs. They wanted a certain percentage of funding to go to minority-owned businesses or even to the communities that were being severely impacted during COVID. I think some of the challenges that we're seeing as these programs move from phase one to phase two, or as they look to expand, is that some of these severely impacted communities also, unfortunately, lack the infrastructure for a lot of these programs. I know with parklets, you need sidewalk space or certain streets that have a speed limit of under 35 miles an hour just to keep these spaces that are safe. And so I think that it is important to distribute these programs to other parts of the community that are in need. But I think for cities to deploy these programs, they need to start thinking about what additional transportation interventions will be needed, what additional resources will be needed from these communities, as well as, from a budget standpoint, and how they can adequately do business outreach to make sure that minority-owned businesses or businesses in these communities are aware that these programs exist. So they need to, I think a little bit about marketing and communication in making sure that these programs start to be a little bit more equitably distributed.
Norma, have you started thinking about the future of recovery and how some of your current practices might be made more permanent, especially, both how the city functions, but also to the public space and the importance of it moving forward from an equity perspective.
And David, I want to share a couple of examples, and I think and this really also alludes also to or responds to your last question. LA County Parks and Recreation actually worked with the private sector, and Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, now Council Member-elect Mark Ridley Thomas for the City of Los Angeles, where we transformed, where we're in the process of transforming a 100-acre golf course into two large developments. One would be, with a nonprofit to build a tennis center that would provide tremendous community benefit and access. And the other is a private development where there will be a public park, a public golf course, golf amenity, but also private development that will help to pay for all of the public and community services and amenities. So this for us actually was very transformational. We're not necessarily in the business of retail and the business of managing private development on golf courses, but we believe that this is an example and a model for us to look at those public-private partnerships and to look at opportunities to continue to push through equity issues, bringing park amenities, park services, park programs. I saw that Dan Knapp is on viewing, and I just have to give him a shout out and looking at opportunities for, I mentioned last time, workforce development, and so we are also in the process of working on another project with the private sector. And what we're including as part of that that negotiations is that there is a partnership with the Conservation Corps for one, job creation, but also workforce development to ensure that youth are trained and that those youth are then creating a pathway for job development. And so I see that these for us are opportunities. And lastly, I mentioned earlier Measure A, and the voters of Los Angeles County overwhelmingly, I think this was the first park equity ballot measure in the country that was close to 75% approval rate. What that will do is also allocate 30% of the resources to vulnerable communities of color. And in January, we are gonna open up proposals and a grant program for $33 million in Los Angeles County to really spearhead park development in our most vulnerable communities. And we're doing it much more quickly than we did, but we feel that because of COVID and because of what we've learned from COVID and the communities that have been impacted the most because of COVID, we have to really lead, put these public dollars into the public, in public hands to really create parks and open spaces in our most vulnerable communities. So these are just some examples for us that are gonna guide our thinking, our action, and very, very committed as an organization to be and very mindful of the need for parks, but the need also for parks to be developed intentionally in communities that are most vulnerable.
And it sounds as though from moving towards permanence in this process, you're continuing to operate more quickly, perhaps, as a key piece. And you even with the new golf course project and the private-public partnership is new ways of viewing how we, the business model perhaps behind this, which again, some of the learnings coming out of the pandemic. Midori, you've been thinking long-term as well as your traditional tactical urbanism background. What are you starting to think is necessary? What can we carry forward? What are we learning differently when we look to the long term?
Yeah, I would say besides just getting cities and agencies and neighborhoods excited about pushing forward projects that might have been on the shelf and dusting those off. I just love what Norma ended with. I think this is such an opportunity to engage and invite communities, especially communities that haven't been at the table of urban planning projects before and haven't felt empowered to advocate for themselves, and weren't invited to those processes. Now that folks are walking around and seeing, new parklets in their neighborhood and maybe even walking around their neighborhoods more, it's such an opportunity to engage those folks in longer term planning processes. I think it would be a real shame if cities and planning departments didn't seize on this opportunity to have people really involved in that next stage. It's beyond the tactical, beyond the temporary, but how do we get folks involved in really shaping their city long term and feel part of that kind of co-creation process with the public sector? It's an opportunity to get people excited about the urban design of their streets and shapes of their cities that I don't know if people might have been thinking about before, now that they're faced with it, and they're walking their dog or their daily routines.
Brian, do you think that the citizenry, the public is developing a new kind of awareness of public space and ways of moving about or being co-creators?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I mean, I think actually one of the most essential benefits of tactical urbanism is it's temporary. And, it's an opportunity to sort of iterate on an idea, make changes, see what works, see what doesn't work. And, Midori brought up, making sure people are at the table. It's like tactical urbanism, you're going to their table. You're going into their community. And so you're not asking who's not at the table, it's whose table are we not at. And if we're going to design a park, we're not going to set up a presentation and workshop in the local library. We're going to go to where that park goes and do some temporary experimentation. We actually did that for a project. We're working with an affordable housing provider where part of the project is closing the nearby street and turning it into a park. And as part of the outreach process, we had an initial design that we worked on with the Parks Department, but we laid it out, with a bouncy house where the playground is going to go, a rolled out AstroTurf where the patch of grass was going to go, a resource fair where the plaza, and we tested things out and realized things needed to move around. We realized that the people that were walking the dog looking for a spot for their dog to do their business, hey, we need a pea patch over there. So it's the tactical urbanism is a great way to actually engage the constituents, the users, and it forces you to do it there. And so, and it's, it's a lot easier to set something up for a day, figure out it doesn't work and then redraw it than it is to build it and then have to unbuild it and rebuild it again in a different way when you find out it doesn't work. I think, the thing that people are realizing, I think now, is the value of the public realm and how much of it has been dedicated to cars and how much, our solution has been to, whenever there's traffic, is to build more street, make more lanes, widen our streets, and at the cost of the public realm and the cost of public safety. And what we've all done since March is we've been working remotely. We've changed our schedule. We are, our entire traffic patterns have changed. Instead of building our roadways for, 8 or 7 to 9 a.m. in the morning, and in the other direction, 4 to 6 p.m., we can actually do something different and maybe reuse some of that residual space or take some more space back. We're finding out that parking patterns change. We're finding out that, sometimes we can have a 15-minute neighborhood. We can walk to so many more things that we weren't walking to in the past. And so there's a lot of things that are going to come out of this that we took for granted for such a long time, because it was just the same thing we just kept on doing over and over again. It's been a shock to the system for so many things, and how we use our public realm, I think, is going to be one of those.
Just reminded me of that movie Groundhog Day, where you wake up and do the same thing over and over again.
Over and over again.
We just got a major wake-up call that the future may not be as we were experiencing it each and every day. The value of tactical urbanism, co-creation that Midori mentioned, it's place governance, that you're engaging the people in their place to help govern their own space. And it's something that we're all tremendously excited about. We've been spending the last 60 minutes chit chat. I'm going to go to some of the questions now from the audience and make sure that we get your feedback on this. First, starting with Lauren. Lauren actually points to Norma and says, "Can't help but think of you as our own Leslie from Parks and Rec." And her question is, with all of the parks being, oh, someone just took it away from me. Let me go back. Oh, there we go. Oh, now they put it back in the other one. Oh, goodness, I've lost it. We'll come back to her question. Anyone who's helping to facilitate, let's just leave the screens alone for a moment. Getting to Steve's question, it seems that retail is one of the toughest nuts to crack for distancing, as Black Friday really showed. How can the distancing approach be applied to retail, and how might brick and mortar be different going forward? How about a volunteer from our 6 panelists now? I'll include yourself in this, Kraig. So retail and distancing.
So, I mean, part of it is sort of the practical of, if we have a limited capacity within a commercial establishment, we need places for queuing or for, sort of waiting or doing other activities. And so we've actually been working with a couple of the business districts to actually look at expanding the sidewalk area. And so not creating a parklet, but actually expanding the sidewalk. And, it was something that has emerged because of COVID, but was actually also something that probably needed to be done in the past anyways. There's this one very popular store that sells roller skates, and whenever they have a new release, there's a line out the door for 200 people waiting for, and now they're in front of somebody else's business. And so expanding the public realm, not just for a single business, but for the collective, is something that we're definitely looking at as ways to sort of serve businesses. I think there has been sort of inherent concern of turning the public realm over to retailers for fear of it looking like a sidewalk sale. But I think it's one of those things that we have to balance, but having more public space, more pedestrian space available for queuing, I think is an essential thing. But there's also ways to also address some of that through technology, whether it's sort of reservation systems. I think Yelp has a reservation systems for retailers. So there are ways to sort of address it, both through technology, but also through the sort of repurposing of the public realm.
And Shannon, I'm assuming when you were talking about curb management, this plays into that role as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of to just jump off of what Brian was saying, we've also kind of early on in this pandemic worked with DLBA to demonstrate this concept of a flex zone. And one of those components was almost the social distancing, colorful decals that were placed on the sidewalk to indicate locations for pedestrian queuing in kind of a fun manner. But going back to Steve's question a little bit, I think technology will certainly play a role. I've wanted to do some shopping at Lululemon, and I need to now schedule a personal shopping time to go into the store, which is really interesting. I think it kind of improves on the consumer experience a little bit and getting that kind of white glove service. But I also think that the public realm could be used as a location to pick up purchases. So a lot of stores, you now order online and they actually have your purchase ready to go for you, and you just need to give them your name and they hand you your bag. And so I could see the public realm, or even during this whole restriction on outdoor dining, some of those spaces being used for retail for just that purpose.
Thanks so much for that. There's a multitude of strategies that are being deployed, many resources available, and happy to help through IDA as well. Getting back to Laura's question, though, it really was pointed, Norma, at all that needs to be done. What is being done by the county to keep the parks clean and sanitized? And you alluded to this, but maybe a bit more detail.
We take, one is parks did not close at all while we closed our buildings. We made sure that all the parks were available for outdoor walking, just respite, as I've mentioned. And so we've taken the need to maintain at a very high level and disinfect very seriously. What I did is I commissioned a task force comprised of, departments like Beaches and Harbors or City of LA, and invited cities throughout the county to participate. We worked with our subject matter experts to develop disinfection and cleaning protocols for COVID. And what we did is we developed a manual that really looked at everything that we must do to really clean and disinfect in our restrooms and high touch areas. And we disseminated it to every city in Los Angeles County, and developed really a standard to really support, so that parks and open spaces were not places where people felt concerned for their safety, but that there were some very strong protocols for cleanliness and disinfection. And I have to say that we have not had one related outbreak in any one of our parks and restrooms as it pertains to the public. Employees is a different story, and so I think that we really mobilized early on, and very confident that the high touch spaces in parks, not just in my system, but throughout Los Angeles County and all of the local jurisdictions, have really maintained them at really high degree.
Appreciate that. Kind of related to that question that we repurpose, David is curious with all of the repurposing that's going on to pedestrian friendly areas. And he speaks of testing sites, food banks, gyms, you name it. There's been a whole host of repurposing. He's hoping that you all could speak a little bit to the functional traffic flow and the pedestrian protection associated with this. It might include working with the bottom line safety of workers as well as pedestrians being paramount. If not your expertise, perhaps who do you work with, or who are your partners that you think are most adept at understanding this new balance between the traffic flow in these mixed use spaces? I see Brian shaking his head.
Yeah, I mean, I think safety is it's a question of actual and perception, because we obviously want our pedestrians and cyclists and diners and patrons and parklet users to be safe in those spaces in actuality, but we also want them to feel safe. And those are two different things. And we typically end up working with our public works partners, our transportation departments, and even with the permanent parklets, we have tended to design those in ways so that there are hard edges, even if there's a little bit of planting on top of them, but we use steel planters, we use concrete planters. We make those edges very, very well defined. And that's something that we didn't necessarily see in some of the initial parklets that were being built in other communities, where I was on Divisadero in San Francisco, and they had cable rails, and I can't tell you how not safe I felt there. But not to call anybody out, but that was just an example. And then today, even with the temporary parklets, we had worked with downtown San Pedro, and they were using concrete K-rails and had them wrapped with sort of temporary finishes. Although I think, when you're able to get new ones, maybe you can do something interesting with those. The city of Long Beach had deployed all their temporary parklets have water-filled K-rails, so it's a little bit easier to deploy. But we also have to be very sensitive to where we're locating them. An example in Long Beach is on 2nd Street in Belmont Shore. The speed limit there is 25 miles an hour. Practically most of the time, the speeds actually, because the traffic pattern, because of the grid structure, is closer to 15, 20 miles an hour, very appropriate. But you go over the bridge into 2nd Street into Naples, the posted speed limit is higher. Cars drive much faster. And because of various purposes, it's a wider street, longer distances between traffic lights, and they had parklets there too. And I probably would not have deployed them there even in a temporary fashion. And what happened was one of the parklets got obliterated overnight because some knuckleheads were drag racing down the street, and they're not following the speed limit, but they're driving quite fast. and obliterated the parklet. And so there's now growing consternation about parklets on that stretch of 2nd Street, but there's a different way to address that. And we're actually talking to the Business Association, talking to the council office, even Public Works, about how that street can actually be reconfigured to promote similar traffic speeds in Belmont Shore, but also expand that sidewalk area so that they're not parklets, but they're actually an expanded sidewalk. So you have to be sensitive about the existing street conditions and where you're deploying those so that the actual and the perception of safety is there.
Dora, you're shaking your head. Can you add to the balance in the traffic flow and how that works in these mixed new ways of envisioning public space, or we go on to the next question?
Sure. Just a quick, I totally agree with Brian. It's not only the physical safety, but in longer term strategies too. It's how can you, now that they're placed in the right locations and on the right stretches of streets, how do you kind of mentally slow down the driver, whether it's with a colored or textured pattern on the street that just kind of tells the driver, I'm not in my, I'm not going to barrel through here at 50. I'm actually like in a different type of zone. Maybe I feel a texture on the ground. Maybe I see a colorful pattern, just to kind of visual cues to kind of let that driver know to just take it down a notch in terms of speed and look around and be more aware of their surroundings. I think there's a whole host of strategies. First and foremost, the right locations.
Right. And that's the essence of urban design. We've always had those tools to narrow things, to unconsciously bring people down. Norma, were you nodding your head because you wanted to respond into this question? No, you're good. Okay. Yeah, we have another question from Atakan, and it really speaks a little bit to this idea of zoning. And the specific question is, in Pomona, they're updating their zoning, and they're curious about the opinion of zoning to the center line of the streets. Maybe Shannon or Midori, Kraig, anyone who's seen this idea of expanding zoning to the center of the streets, perhaps then providing greater guidelines or guidance or authority to the municipalities. Is anyone seeing this anywhere in your work?
I haven't seen it yet, so I'm really interested in that. I think, though, related to zoning, this with all of these interventions being in the public realm, it makes me start to think about urban design standards moving forward, and how could our zoning codes or requirements within the zoning code provide standards for that urban or public realm space to make it more pedestrian friendly, to make it more vibrant, to provide larger sidewalks, to provide some greening elements. So I would hope that, and that could be included, in the zoning code, or sometimes they're in like streetscape design guidelines, but that's really interesting. I haven't heard about the zoning, but I would hope that some of these urban design best practices as a result of what we're seeing from the pandemic on our streets could somehow make it into our codes as requirements.
Anything else on that question, Brian? Quick.
I just have a sort of a quick sort of anecdotal part to that is, the tough thing with zoning and the public right of way is how dedications and vacations happen that might be associated with adjacent development or with city-led projects. We've had a couple projects where we've closed the entirety of streets to become park space, and on paper, we're not allowed to call them park space because that would require the vacation of that right of way, which then would go to the adjacent, would along the center line go to the adjacent property owners. And so, it's an interesting struggle, and maybe the center line solution is it, but then, how does that jive with the public realm? What we're seeing more frequently with zoning codes is specific plans that are associated. And so there's a zoning code, but then there's also no mobility and infrastructure and open space element to that. I don't know how practical that is to do on a citywide basis, but if you're doing them in various communities, having a specific plan, I think allows that sort of greater sort of comprehensive approach to developing the public realm as well as developing the private properties.
And I imagine that's potentially in overlays, one on top of the other, et cetera. We started off strong. We talked about the equity of public space. We talked about the challenges of evolving public space. And Jim asked a very pointed and important question that really delves into our citizens who are affected by homelessness. And with Jim's concern for safety and health, given the great volume of homelessness that utilize public space as well, especially it looks like in Orange Park, which is adjacent to some restaurants. This is a complex issue. We could have an entire webinar on this program, but you work in this public space. Share some insights in how do we balance this idea of public space for all, and yet we have some of our population that is affected by homelessness. How does that play into this conversation?
And David, I'll start. We developed a very proactive program to work with our homeless park visitors. And our response is we want to make sure that they're healthy, that they have shelter, and they have the ability to actually store their belongings in a safe place. And so we develop a partnership with multiple agency partnership to really respond to helping to address homeless populations. And we've taken an approach where it's our responsibility to try to really help facilitate services for the homeless, because we know that homeless encampments are not safe for homeless right now during COVID. It's actually increasingly cold, and it's not. And then we understand that the public and adjacent residents may have concerns, and so we very aggressively, proactively work with LASA, which is our homeless authority. We work with a specialized team of mental health services to really provide shelter for and supportive services for our homeless. And to the point that LA County Parks, we actually have four temporary 24/7 homeless shelters in our gyms. That we actually work with a third-party nonprofit provider, as well as for inclement weather. About 12 of our parks provide shelters for homeless, but that means indoors with lots of safety precautions. And so I know that this is a very complex, very difficult, very, very difficult issue. But we during this time, we try to balance those complexities with empathy and support and understanding for all visitors of our parks who see our parks as places for them to enjoy.
I also would love to entertain, Kraig, some thoughts from you, because I know our industry speaks to this, very frequently, and all the partners that we work with, or I should say, you work with as part of a downtown management organization. It's really been amplified because of the pandemic. It's not a new challenge. Downtown Long Beach, works in a similar way in partnership, I assume.
Yes. We have addressed the problem prior to the pandemic, and certainly it's been magnified since the pandemic. And discussing public space and how to utilize the public space, whether it is actually, and as I mentioned earlier, we did not have any public parklets in our city. So the business owner really managed that space as an extension of their patio and or business. So they were able to restrict the use of that space to their customer or their consumer. And when we started putting these public spaces out there very quickly, the question was raised, are these going to be maintained as private or public spaces? Because if they are public spaces, who's going to be managing them? Who can use them? And who is ultimately responsible, and who runs the risk of these spaces? And some of these questions, tough questions to answer, remained unanswered at the time because of the need to put out the space and allow those businesses to use. So on the surface, they are deemed as private spaces. But again, it's how we manage those spaces. This morning, I just got a text from one of my board members who heard on local radio that a local community, a coastal community in Southern California, is turning their parklet space into public space and allowing the carry-out diner to use these spaces as public spaces. Now, my question is, who's managing those spaces? Who's sanitizing those spaces? Who's disinfecting those spaces? And who's ultimately going to be accountable for those spaces? Again, it's great that, you know, this space can be used, but under the health orders that we're currently under, it raises another question. Again, going back to the homeless issue, the population that, if it, in fact it is public, could any member of the community use this space as long as they want to use it for? I mean, do they have to be eating at that adjacent restaurant to be using a public space? And then how long are they going to, I mean, how long can they stay there? And who maintains the space after they leave? So it's more of a management question following the hypothetical or philosophical question of that, of really who manages that space.
Well, I think you've all done a tremendous job in illustrating the complexity of what's happening during the pandemic, the opportunities that are provided by what we've had to go through these last 9 months, and perhaps for another 4 or so. For myself, I've always considered it the evolving nature of civic governance. And hopefully I think we've illustrated that it's not just government, it's not just the private sector. There is a complex body of service providers, partners, for-profit, not-for-profit, and everyone is working together and doing more so today to really begin to understand we may be looking at a different future than what we had just back in the beginning of 2020. We're coming to the end of our time, as noted, and I'd like to leave a minute for any closing comments from Kraig and Downtown Long Beach Association. But 30 seconds for each of the panelists. Let me thank you for sharing your time with us. If you had to think about one other topic other than public space that you think is going to be given birth out of the pandemic that we need to think about differently as we have public space. 1, thank you for your time. 2, what would be your suggestion for future conversations like this? And we'll begin in the order. Well, Shannon beat me to it. She's ready to go.
It kind of actually builds off of what Brian brought up with us all kind of working from home and being really great at telecommuting. I think we're spending more time at home and in our neighborhoods. And so this whole concept of neighborhood oriented development, I think, is strengthened, where if we only really need to go within a 3-mile radius of our house, it starts to kind of, as a designer and planner, make me think a little bit different about the amenities that I want to provide at the neighborhood level, the connectivity, the open spaces, the activities, the amount of restaurants. And so I think, that's how I feel like with the change in travel patterns, I could see that, starting to shift in our ways of thinking about planning.
And what are those long-term shifts going to be? We're still waiting to see what unfolds. Brian, I think you're ready.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'll just sort of piggyback on Shannon. I mean, the 15-minute neighborhood is going to be something that we're going to see a lot more come forward, whether it is in our urban environments or, these sort of second tier or sort of, streetcar communities, or even as we go rural. But, I would say that making sure that's done through a lens of equity and making sure that everybody has within their neighborhood access to education, access to work, access to open space and medical services and fresh food. And so, while, I think there's a greater focus on that 15-minute neighborhood, is making sure that equity is carried through. And Parks has been leading the way, but I think there's economic and educational aspects to it as well that we need to be mindful of.
Thanks, Brian. Norma, if not Parks and Open Space, or what are you hearing perhaps from your colleagues in the county? What are some other topics we should be exploring? Oh, she may have frozen, so I'm going to shift over to you, Midori.
Yeah.
What else are you thinking about?
Yeah, I would kind of say ditto to what Shannon and Brian's mentioned. I think the holistic, walkable, inclusive neighborhood, if we're lucky enough to be able to telecommute and have a job that we can do that, the future of work is definitely changing. I don't think people are necessarily going to go back 5 days a week, 40 hours. And if there are neighborhood amenities and units and change in retail mix around, where we live in a walkable zone, can we have some of those work from home amenities just like near home, kind of between house and work? I think there's a lot of creative land use and, uses that need to be added and infused into our neighborhood units to make them the higher quality of life for everybody. I think we're just realizing how important that is.
Glad to have you back, Norma. Some parting thoughts?
Thank you. I froze, and I'm glad to be back. I just wanted to, echo the comments. We've launched, an initiative, very aggressive and ambitious one, that every child in Los Angeles County should have a park within walking distance, within 10-minute walk. And so, it's a daunting task, but I think this really dovetails really nicely when we think about building the neighborhoods, making sure that specifically those communities who don't have those amenities that are so critical to the well-being of children and families have that support in those spaces. So I think having a conversation about what is also that public infrastructure that is needed to create thriving neighborhoods as part of a discussion would be something I'm always very interested in talking about.
Or perhaps it's the innovation of what is a park, and it's re-envisioning public space. I'll quickly leave you with mine, which is the pandemic changed everything for us. Imagine what autonomous vehicles are going to do in this same regard. I'll kick it back to you, Kraig. Thank you so much. Thank all of our panelists. It was a tremendous honor to be able to be on this webinar with you all.
Thanks, David. I really appreciate it. And just my concluding thoughts from this webinar is really the elevated role that the bids have played over the last 9 months. I feel as though that now the bids, the new capacity from a leadership perspective that the bids have played, and it's really elevated their role in their local communities. I've seen it in Long Beach. We've been meeting on a weekly basis with the 9 or 10 other bids in our city, and it's really been able to solidify what we've all done collectively, and it hasn't gone unnoticed by the city and their partners. And so it's really, we've taken advantage of an unfortunate situation, but certainly I think the bids will come out much stronger following the pandemic, and I'm really looking forward to the new roles that they'll be playing and the best practices that they'll be bringing to their own community. Norma, Shannon, Brian, and Midori, thank you very much for participating today. Not only for participating today, but for the contributions you make every day to the community and to the organizations that you work with. David, thank you for your partnership, but especially your leadership and the IDA's leadership that has brought so many contributions to our own communities and our own organizations, and I appreciate that. And just a special shout out locally to the Long Beach Community Foundation. I know Brian has worked very closely with them. They have provided funding for the Open Streets program in our city, and I want to express my appreciation to them as well. And again, thanks very much to the DLBA staff for helping put this together. And thank you for all the participants that took time out of their Friday, whether it's the morning on the West Coast or on the afternoon on the East Coast. David, thank you again for your work with us. And again, thanks for everyone for participating. Enjoy the weekend and stay safe and be well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.